I dropped out to care for grandma. Parents lied, calling me a failure. 15 years later at their party, the TV showed a $20 million medical wing dedication. When the governor said my name, Dad collapsed. I am 34 years old, and right now I am sitting in the living room of my downtown Chicago penthouse, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at the freezing, gray waters of Lake Michigan. In my left hand, I am holding a cup of artisan coffee that probably cost more than some people make in an hour. In my right hand, I am holding a cheap, mass-produced holiday greeting card covered in tacky fake snow. This card arrived in my secure building's mailroom yesterday. It was sent by my mother, Beatrice. I opened the envelope earlier this morning, and a flimsy plastic gift card to a discount grocery chain fluttered out and landed on my custom imported rug. The value loaded on that little piece of plastic is exactly $20. Inside the card, written in my mother's overly dramatic, looping cursive handwriting, is a short, deeply passive-aggressive note. It reads, "Valerie, we hope you are managing to stay warm this winter. We know things must be very tight for you. Perhaps in the new year, you might finally look into taking some evening classes at the community college. It is never too late to try and fix your mistakes. Love, Mom and Dad." I sat on my expensive velvet sofa, reading that note over and over again, and I actually started laughing. I laughed so hard that my sides began to hurt, and the sound echoed through my massive, empty apartment. You see, my parents, Beatrice and Harrison Kensington, genuinely believe that I am living in grinding, miserable poverty. They believe that I am a disgraced, pathetic college dropout who completely ruined her life 15 years ago. They think I am probably working 2 minimum wage jobs just to afford a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood. Every single year, they send me these condescending little cards with a $20 handout, not out of kindness, but to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. It makes them feel incredibly superior. What Beatrice and Harrison absolutely do not know, what they could not possibly comprehend in their wildest, most delusional dreams, is that the daughter they threw away like garbage is currently the sole founder and chief executive officer of Nova Health Tech. I run a remote medical technology empire that is currently valued at over $400 million. I do not need their $20 grocery card. I could buy the entire supermarket chain, fire the board of directors, and turn their flagship store into a parking lot before breakfast. But I have kept my massive success an absolute, airtight secret from my family for over a decade. I hired a very charismatic vice president to act as the public face of my corporation. I keep my name completely out of the media. I have lived like a ghost, quietly building my fortress brick by brick in the dark. Because I know exactly how toxic narcissists operate. If my parents caught even a single cent of my wealth, they would suddenly pretend they had supported me all along. They would swoop in, demanding access to my bank accounts, demanding that I fund their lavish lifestyle, and demanding that I bail out my older brother, Preston, who is the undisputed golden child of the family. But I am not going to give them a single dime. Instead, I am going to let them keep playing their cruel little games, completely unaware that a massive, inescapable collision course has already been set in motion. The trap is laid, and when it finally snaps shut, it is going to destroy their fake reality on live television. To truly understand why my parents are the way they are, you have to understand the absolute hierarchy of the Kensington household. Growing up in the wealthy, aggressively manicured suburbs of Chicago, my family was obsessed with one thing and one thing only: optics. How things looked to the outside world. My father, Harrison, was a senior executive at a mid-sized financial firm. He was a man who communicated entirely in booming, authoritative lectures. He treated his family the same way he treated his junior employees, expecting absolute submission and zero pushback. My mother, Beatrice, was a social climber of the highest order. She practically lived at the local country club, spending her days drinking expensive wine and trading vicious gossip with the other wealthy wives. To Beatrice, her children were not human beings to be loved or nurtured. We were simply accessories. We were investments in her social portfolio. And in that portfolio, my older brother Preston was the absolute blue chip stock. Preston is 3 years older than me, and he earned the title of the Golden Child simply by being born a son and possessing a loud, obnoxious personality that perfectly mirrored my father. Preston was lazy. He rarely opened a textbook, he constantly talked back to his teachers, and he expected the world to simply hand him whatever he wanted. But whenever Preston failed a class, my parents magically produced top-tier, expensive tutors to do his homework for him. The contrast between us was sickening. Let me give you a perfect example. When Preston graduated high school with a painfully average C- grade point average, my parents treated it like he had just won a Nobel Prize. They leased him a brand new luxury sports car and rented out the grand ballroom at the country club. They hired professional caterers and invited 200 of their closest acquaintances to toast to Preston's brilliant future. 3 years later, I graduated high school. I did not get a C-. I was the valedictorian of my graduating class, and I secured a full-ride academic scholarship to study computer science at a highly prestigious university on the East Coast. There was no party for me. There was no luxury car. On the night of my graduation, we sat around the dining room table, eating a completely average roast chicken. My father gave me a brief, uninterested nod over his newspaper. My mother, Beatrice, actually sighed with profound disappointment. She looked at me from across the table and told me that sitting in a dark room staring at a computer screen was an incredibly unladylike career path. She told me I was going to end up socially awkward and unmarried, and that she honestly did not know how she was going to explain my nerdy major to her friends at the tennis club. I was an obligation. Preston was the legacy. I learned that lesson very early on, and I stopped trying to fight it. I realized that the only way to survive the Kensington house was to put my head down, secure my own exit strategy, and get as far away from Illinois as humanly possible. So I packed my bags, moved halfway across the country, and threw myself entirely into my university studies. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was actually breathing clean air. I felt free. There was only one single thread that kept me tied to my hometown, and her name was Margaret. Margaret was my father's mother, but looking at them, you would never believe they shared the same DNA. While my parents lived in a sprawling, ostentatious mansion filled with cold marble and uncomfortable antique furniture, Margaret lived in a small, aging, modest house in a quiet working-class neighborhood about an hour away. My parents almost never visited her. They considered her working-class background an embarrassment to their newly acquired wealth. But to me, Margaret's house was the only place in the world that felt like an actual home. When I was a little girl, while Beatrice was busy attending charity galas and forgetting to pick me up from school, Margaret was the one who consistently showed up. Her house always smelled like old books, warm vanilla, and baking bread. She was the one who taught me how to read chapter books. When I got older and started getting obsessed with technology, Margaret would sit at her worn wooden kitchen table for hours, drinking tea and listening to me passionately explain complex coding languages that she absolutely did not understand. She did not care about the technical details. She just loved watching my eyes light up. Margaret was the only human being in my entire bloodline who offered me a safe harbor. During my freshman year of college, I was absolutely thriving. I was holding a flawless 3.9 grade point average. I was selected as the lead programmer on a massive, prestigious robotics project that was usually reserved only for senior students. I was building a brilliant future. I called Margaret every single Sunday evening to tell her about my week. But midway through my second semester, those phone calls started to change. At first, it was small things. Margaret would ask me how high school was going, completely forgetting that I was already away at university. Then she started forgetting the names of her neighbors. I tried to bring it up to my father, Harrison, but he aggressively brushed me off, telling me that old people just get forgetful and that I was being overly dramatic. Then, the terrifying midnight phone call happened. It was a freezing Tuesday night in early February. I was in my dorm room, surrounded by circuit boards and empty coffee cups, when my phone rang. It was Margaret's next-door neighbor. The neighbor sounded completely panicked. She told me she had just found my grandmother wandering down the middle of the street in the freezing rain. Margaret was wearing nothing but a thin cotton nightgown. She was sobbing, desperately searching the neighborhood for a little terrier dog that had passed away more than a decade ago. My heart completely shattered into a million pieces. The doctors at the local hospital evaluated her the very next morning. The medical diagnosis was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. Margaret was suffering from an aggressive, fast-moving form of dementia. The social worker made it perfectly clear to the family that Margaret could absolutely no longer live alone in her house. She was becoming a severe danger to herself. She needed to be placed in a specialized, full-time memory care facility immediately. I knew that state-run nursing homes were chronically understaffed, bleak, and deeply depressing places. Margaret needed a high-quality private care facility where she would be treated with actual dignity and warmth. The monthly costs for those places were astronomical, but I knew my parents had the money. My father was a senior executive. My mother wore diamond tennis bracelets to the grocery store. It was his own mother wandering in the freezing rain. I assumed, without a single shadow of a doubt, that they would step up and do the right thing. I was so incredibly naive. I sat on the edge of my narrow, uncomfortable twin bed in my college dorm room. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely unlock my phone. I dialed my father's number. It went to voicemail twice before he finally answered. I was openly sobbing into the receiver. I frantically explained everything the hospital social worker had told me. I told him how terrified Margaret was, how she did not understand where she was, and how we needed to secure a deposit for a private memory care facility by the end of the week before the hospital discharged her. I told him we had to move fast. The silence on the other end of the phone was absolute ice. When Harrison finally spoke, his voice lacked even a single, microscopic ounce of human empathy. He sighed loudly, the heavy, irritated sigh of a busy executive who had just been interrupted during a very important golf game. "Valerie, you need to calm down," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We have looked at the numbers, and your mother, and I simply do not have the liquidity right now to fund a luxury care facility for her. It is out of the question." I stopped breathing. The air in my dorm room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I asked him what on earth he meant by lacking liquidity. I aggressively reminded him that they had just remodeled their massive gourmet kitchen for the third time in 5 years. I knew exactly how much money he made. And that is when Harrison delivered the crushing, unforgivable blow. He casually, almost proudly, explained that they had just written a massive, 6-figure check to cover Preston. My brother, the 22-year-old golden child, had decided he did not want to work an entry-level corporate job after barely graduating from his state college. Instead, Preston announced he wanted to be an entrepreneur. He had pitched my parents some vague, absolutely ridiculous idea for a boutique lifestyle startup incubator. It was not a real business. It had no product, no service, and no clients. It was quite literally a slush fund. It was a massive pool of my parents' cash designed to allow my brother to rent a highly expensive luxury loft in downtown Chicago, lease luxury vehicles, throw massive networking parties, and play the role of a hotshot chief executive officer without actually doing a single day of real work. My parents had completely drained their liquid savings and liquidated solid stock portfolios to fund my brother's glorified fraternity house. I started screaming into the phone. I lost my mind. I asked my father how he could possibly choose a fake, imaginary startup over his own mother's physical safety. I begged him to pull the funding back. I told him that if they did not pay for a private facility, Margaret was going to be dumped into a miserable, underfunded state ward where she would be strapped to a bed and pumped full of sedatives until she died. Then I heard the phone shuffle. My mother, Beatrice, snatched the receiver from my father. Her voice was sharp, venomous, and laced with profound annoyance. "Listen to me very carefully, Valerie," Beatrice snapped. "Stop being so deeply dramatic. Margaret made her own financial bed by refusing to invest wisely when she was younger, and now she simply has to sleep in it. Preston is building a massive legacy for the Kensington family name. Margaret is just reaching the natural end of her life. We are washing our hands of this entire situation. Let the state handle her." Then, she hung up the phone. I sat in my dorm room, listening to the dead, mechanical dial tone buzzing in my ear. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply evil, that it physically knocked the wind out of my lungs. They were actually going to abandon her. The woman who had raised my father, the woman who had baked with me and loved me, was going to be discarded like actual human garbage just so my arrogant brother could pretend to be a tech mogul. I looked up from my phone and stared at my computer monitor. Lines of brilliant, elegant robotics code stared back at me. I looked at the heavy textbooks stacked neatly on my desk. I looked at the printed syllabus for my final exams, which were only 3 weeks away. I had fought so incredibly hard to escape Illinois. I had fought so hard to build this brilliant, independent life for myself on the East Coast. I was on the absolute fast track to top-tier summer internships and a 6-figure career right out of college. I had the world by the throat. But then I closed my eyes, and the image of my grandmother wandering in the freezing rain, crying and looking for a dead dog, flashed behind my eyelids. There was no choice to make. Not really. If I stayed in school, Margaret would die terrified and alone in a sterile state facility. I opened my laptop, navigated to the university portal, and pulled up the official academic withdrawal forms. I was going to throw away my full-ride scholarship. I was going to pack up my entire life, move back to the miserable Midwest, and become my grandmother's full-time, 24-hour caregiver. Because absolutely nobody else in the world was going to protect her. I stood in the fluorescent-lit registrar's office the very next morning. The air smelled like old paper and institutional floor cleaner. I was clutching a manila folder tightly against my chest. My academic advisor, an older woman who had championed my robotics project, looked at me with genuine, profound sorrow in her eyes. She had just reviewed my flawless 3.9 grade point average. She leaned across her desk and asked me, her voice breaking slightly, if I was absolutely, 100% certain I wanted to do this. She warned me that walking away from a full-ride scholarship mid-semester meant I would likely never get it back. I swallowed the massive, painful lump in my throat and nodded my head. She picked up a heavy rubber stamp, inked it, and pressed it down onto my official withdrawal forms with a loud, hollow thud. The red ink across the top of the crisp white page read, "Compassionate leave for family care." It was the absolute, undeniable truth printed on university letterhead. But looking at that red ink felt like signing a death sentence for my dreams. I packed my entire dorm room into 2 heavy suitcases in complete silence while my roommate was at class. I dragged those suitcases through the airport, boarded a cheap commercial flight, and flew back to Chicago, leaving behind everything I had worked my entire life to build. I did not shed a single tear on that flight. I knew that crying would not change the brutal reality of what was waiting for me. When I finally arrived at Grandma Margaret's small, aging house, the reality of her rapid mental deterioration hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The house, which used to smell like baking and warmth, now smelled faintly of burnt toast and old, stale lavender. Margaret was sitting in her worn floral armchair, staring blankly at a television that was not even turned on. She looked so incredibly small. She looked fragile. I was only 19 years old, but in that exact moment, I instantly traded my textbooks and weekend study groups for a grueling, soul-crushing caregiver shift. I became an adult overnight. The first 2 months back in Illinois were a living nightmare of severe sleep deprivation. Dementia is a cruel, relentless, invisible thief. I had to go to the hardware store and buy heavy metal deadbolts, installing them high up on all the exterior doors so Margaret could not wander out into the freezing nights. I spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, gently spoon-feeding her lukewarm oatmeal, desperately coaxing her to swallow when her brain simply forgot how to chew. I bathed her. I managed her complex, ever-changing medication schedule. While I was slowly losing my mind to exhaustion, I watched the cruel lens of social media broadcast my family's alternate universe. I saw my mother, Beatrice, posting heavily filtered photos of her lavish wine-tasting trips to Napa Valley. I saw Preston posting chaotic, highly produced videos of massive parties at his expensive downtown loft, buying top-shelf liquor for people he barely knew. My parents were completely funding his illusion, while I was literally counting loose change in a jar, just trying to figure out how to afford bread and adult diapers for the woman who birthed my father. By the end of my second month, the tiny emergency savings account I had built from my campus tutoring job was completely, utterly empty. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The wind outside was howling. I was standing in the harsh, buzzing fluorescent aisle of a local pharmacy, staring at a plastic basket holding Margaret's essential prescription medications and a package of nutritional shakes. I pulled up my banking app on my phone. I had exactly $14 left to my name. The total bill for the items in the basket was going to be over $80. Pure, suffocating panic gripped my throat. I walked out of the store empty-handed, got into my beat-up, 12-year-old car and just sat there in the parking lot, shivering violently because the heater was broken. I knew my parents had explicitly washed their hands of the situation. I knew they did not want to be bothered. But I was absolutely desperate. I was not asking for college tuition. I was not asking for a luxury loft like Preston. I was asking for basic survival necessities for their own flesh and blood. I pulled out my phone. I swallowed every single ounce of my pride, and I typed a long, pleading text message to my mother. I explained that Margaret was completely out of her blood pressure medication. I explained that the refrigerator was empty. I begged Beatrice for just $200 to get us through the end of the month. I hit send, and I watched the little delivered notification pop up. I waited in that freezing, broken car for 45 agonizing minutes. Finally, my phone buzzed. I opened the message, expecting at least a reluctant, angry agreement to transfer a small amount of grocery money. Instead, what I read completely stopped my heart. Beatrice's text message was not just a denial. It was a highly calculated, venomous, psychological character assassination. Beatrice wrote, "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. Do not try to use Margaret as a pathetic excuse for the fact that you simply could not handle college academics. We know the truth. We are telling all the neighbors and our friends at the country club that you moved home because you were failing your classes and dropping out. We are not funding your laziness. Do not ever contact us for money again." I sat perfectly still, gripping the cold steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. I read the message a second time, then a third. The sheer psychological cruelty washed over me. It was not enough for them to abandon Margaret. They were absolutely terrified that their wealthy country club friends would find out they abandoned a sick, elderly woman to fund Preston's fake fraternity lifestyle. So, Beatrice aggressively rewrote the narrative. She preemptively destroyed my reputation. She branded me the dropout, ensuring that if I ever tried to tell anyone the truth, they would just dismiss me as a bitter, failing student making up lies. Most 19-year-old girls would have completely broken down. They would have called their mother, screaming and crying, desperately trying to defend themselves against such a massive lie. But as I sat in that freezing car, something deep inside of me permanently snapped. The desperate child who just wanted her parents to love her officially died. In her place, a cold, calculating survivor was born. I realized that fighting with my parents was a complete waste of energy. Words meant absolutely nothing to them. Evidence meant everything. I did not reply to her text. I did not send a single angry word back. Instead, I pressed the buttons on my phone and took a clear, high-resolution screenshot of her entire message, making sure the date and timestamp were perfectly visible. Then I opened my digital files and pulled up the copy of my official university withdrawal paperwork. The paperwork that clearly displayed my flawless 3.9 grade point average. The paperwork with the bold red stamp that proved I left on compassionate leave. I took screenshots of everything. I created a secure, highly encrypted folder on my phone and my laptop. I titled the folder, Motivation. I dragged every single screenshot into that folder, and I locked it away like a loaded weapon. Thank you for following the story this far. If you found this story interesting, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. The first few weeks back in Illinois were a living nightmare of exhaustion. Dementia is a cruel, relentless thief. I had to install extra deadbolts on all the doors so Margaret would not wander out into the freezing nights. I spent hours spoon-feeding her lukewarm oatmeal, coaxing her to eat when she forgot how to chew. I bathed her. I managed her complex medication schedule. But the absolute hardest part was the night terrors. Around 2 in the morning, she would wake up screaming, absolutely convinced that strange men were trying to break through the windows. I would sit on the floor beside her bed for hours, holding her trembling hands and singing soft lullabies until the sun finally came up. While I was losing my mind to sleep deprivation and the crushing emotional weight of watching my grandmother slowly fade away, I realized something incredibly profound. The healthcare system was completely broken. Managing Margaret's remote care, trying to coordinate with doctors over the phone, and keeping track of her rapidly changing needs was a disorganized, chaotic mess. So, I decided to fix it. During the quiet hours of the night, when she was finally asleep, I would sit at her worn wooden kitchen table, brew a pot of cheap, bitter coffee, and open my laptop. I poured every ounce of my rage, my grief, and my sharp intellect into the glowing lines of code on my screen. I looked at the broken, chaotic healthcare systems I had to navigate for her, and I started designing elegant digital solutions. I saw how isolated homebound individuals were, and I began quietly building an accessible telehealth and medical management platform from absolute scratch. I was designing software specifically built for patients and remote caregivers who were forgotten by the traditional system. I was a ghost to the Kensington family. But in the digital world, sitting in that dark kitchen between 3 and 6 in the morning, I was laying the foundation for a massive empire. For 3 grueling but profoundly meaningful years, I remained by my grandmother's side. I watched her memories slowly fade away, but I made absolutely certain that she never spent a single day feeling unloved or abandoned. When Margaret finally passed away, she went peacefully in her sleep, holding my hand. I was 22 years old, and my heart was completely shattered. The funeral was a masterclass in toxic family optics. My parents, Beatrice and Harrison, who had not bothered to visit Margaret a single time in those 3 years, arrived at the memorial service dressed in incredibly expensive designer mourning clothes. They stood near the casket, accepting condolences from their wealthy friends, playing the role of the devastated, grieving son and daughter-in-law. My mother even managed to squeeze out a few theatrical tears for the country club acquaintances who attended. They completely ignored me. They treated me like I was just the hired help who had been managing the estate. A few days after the funeral, the family lawyer contacted us for the reading of Margaret's will. My parents assumed that whatever meager assets my grandmother had left would naturally default to my father. But Margaret knew exactly who her real family was. In her final legally binding testament, she left her small, aging house and a modest $25,000 life insurance policy entirely to me. When the lawyer read that provision aloud in his stuffy office, my mother actually scoffed. She looked at me with total disgust and whispered to my father that a rotting house and $25,000 was a perfectly pathetic inheritance for a college dropout. They did not even bother to contest the will because the amount of money was completely beneath their notice. To them, it was absolute pocket change. To me, it was the seed money for a revolution. I officially listed Margaret's house on the real estate market. The property sold a month later for $210,000. I took that money, combined it with the $25,000 life insurance payout, and officially incorporated my medical software company. I named it Nova Health Tech. I moved into a tiny, deeply unglamorous studio apartment in the industrial district of Chicago, and I went into absolute survival mode. I did not buy new clothes. I did not go out. I lived on cheap ramen noodles and black coffee. I spent 16 hours a day refining my software platform, pitching to massive hospital networks, and facing countless brutal rejections. Corporate executives looked at my resume, saw that I had technically dropped out of my university, and tried to dismiss me. But I refused to take no for an answer. I knew my software was revolutionary because I had built it with a level of compassion and insight that traditional tech developers simply did not possess. The massive breakthrough happened 2 years later. A progressive state health department took a chance on a pilot program using my software for their remote patient monitoring division. The results were absolutely explosive. Patient engagement skyrocketed. Hospital readmission rates dropped dramatically. Within 6 months, 3 neighboring states signed massive, multi-million-dollar contracts with Nova Health Tech. From that moment on, the company grew at a terrifying speed. Over the next decade, Nova Health Tech scaled from a tiny startup operating out of a studio apartment into a digital juggernaut valued at over $400 million. We acquired smaller tech firms. We built a state-of-the-art corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago. But through it all, I made a highly calculated decision to remain a complete ghost to the public. I strictly instructed my corporate public relations team to keep my name out of the media. I declined flashy magazine interviews. I hired a brilliant, charismatic vice president to act as the public face of the company at major industry conferences. I wanted to build my armor in total secrecy. I knew exactly how my toxic parents operated. To my family, I was still the disgraced failure. Once a year, I would receive that deeply condescending holiday card with the $20 gift card. They genuinely believed I was living in grinding poverty. And I would read those cards sitting in my sprawling downtown penthouse, laughing quietly to myself, because the reality of my family's life was about to become a complete and utter nightmare. While my star had been quietly rising into the stratosphere, my older brother Preston's career was publicly crashing into the ground. My parents had spent over a decade draining their retirement accounts to keep his illusion of success alive. He had launched 4 different companies and driven every single one of them directly into bankruptcy. Preston was now 37 years old and still aggressively playing pretend. His latest illusion was a boutique logistics firm based in downtown Chicago. He loudly pitched the company to everyone in his social circle as a revolutionary disruptor in the supply chain space. But the harsh reality was completely different. It was nothing more than a flashy office space with ridiculously expensive espresso machines, a fleet of leased luxury vehicles for the executive team, and absolutely zero sustainable revenue. Preston was a master at the toxic art of looking highly successful while actually drowning in massive corporate debt. He spent his days attending high-profile networking lunches and his nights putting massive steakhouse dinners on corporate credit cards that were maxed out to their absolute limits. Of course, my parents, Beatrice and Harrison, were completely blind to the reality of his massive financial failure. Or rather, they chose to be blind. They were so deeply desperate to maintain the illusion that they had raised a brilliant business visionary that they completely ignored all the glaring red flags. When Preston's logistics firm failed to make payroll for the 3rd time that year, he did not go to a traditional bank. He went straight to my father. My corporate intelligence team at Nova Health Tech later discovered exactly what happened. Harrison had quietly drained the very last portion of his lucrative executive retirement portfolio. He even went so far as to take out a secretive, highly leveraged second mortgage on their sprawling suburban mansion just to keep my brother's sinking ship afloat. They were literally mortgaging their own financial future to protect Preston from the humiliating reality of his own sheer incompetence. They were so terrified of the country club gossip that they were willing to go completely bankrupt just to keep up appearances. By the time I turned 34, my company had become so massively profitable that I officially launched a venture capital division. We occasionally provided high-interest emergency bridge loans to desperate, struggling tech and logistics firms, or we simply acquired them for parts. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when my executive vice president forwarded me a red-flagged application for a $2 million emergency bailout loan. The digital file came with an urgent note stating that the applicant was days away from defaulting on payroll and facing total corporate liquidation. The financial reports attached to the file were an absolute disaster, showing a company that was basically operating as a massive vanity project. I clicked open the digital dossier on my secure monitor and felt the breath completely leave my lungs. The name of the failing logistics company was right there on the glowing screen. And the signature of the desperate chief executive officer, begging for a $2 million lifeline, was none other than Preston Kensington. I sat perfectly still in my leather ergonomic chair, staring at the screen. The sheer cosmic irony of the universe was almost too heavy to process. My golden child brother, the arrogant boy who had snickered while my parents cut off my college tuition. The man who had called me a pathetic failure was now sitting in his leased downtown office, begging a faceless venture capital firm to save him from total public humiliation. He was completely bankrupt. He had burned through all of his investors' money. He had bled our parents entirely dry. And he had absolutely no idea that the massive multi-million-dollar corporation he was desperately begging for a bailout was entirely owned and operated by the exact same sister he had spent 15 years treating like absolute garbage. He was literally begging the dropout for his financial survival. The absolute poetry of his failure was intoxicating. My hands were actually shaking with adrenaline as I scrolled through his disastrous financial statements. But the universe was not finished delivering its absolute perfect timing. Just as I was reading the final page of my brother's pathetic loan application, my personal assistant walked into my office and handed me the morning mail. Right on top of the stack was a thick, cream-colored cardstock envelope sealed with heavy gold wax and embossed with ornate metallic lettering. It was a formal invitation to my parents' 35th wedding anniversary gala. They had rented out the grand ballroom at their hyper-exclusive country club in the Chicago suburbs. Normally, I threw these performative invitations directly into the garbage disposal without a second thought. I knew exactly what these events were designed to be. They were heavily curated social performances where my mother could parade around in expensive designer gowns and my father could loudly boast to his golf buddies about his incredibly successful son. I was fully prepared to throw the gold foil invitation straight into the trash when my corporate public relations director sent me an urgent email marked high priority. For the past 2 years, I had been quietly working with the board of directors at the Chicago Institute of Advanced Medicine. I had donated $20 million of my own personal wealth to fund the construction of a massive, state-of-the-art medical research and remote care facility. I had explicitly requested to remain an anonymous donor until the building was officially completed. I wanted the facility to be named in honor of my late grandmother, Margaret, because she was the only person in my entire family who ever believed in me. My public relations director was writing to confirm the final logistical details for the facility's official ribbon-cutting ceremony. The email stated that the governor of Illinois would be attending the event to formally reveal my identity and publicly thank Nova Health Tech during a live television broadcast. The local news networks were going to air the dedication ceremony live as a major breaking news segment. I looked closely at the broadcast schedule attached to the email. The official ribbon cutting and the public naming announcement was scheduled to air live on the major Chicago evening news networks at exactly 6 o'clock next Saturday evening. I slowly turned my head and looked back at the gold foil anniversary invitation sitting on my mahogany desk. My parents' 35th anniversary gala at the Suburban Country Club was scheduled for next Saturday evening. The cocktail hour began at 5. Dinner was scheduled to be served at exactly 6 o'clock. I did the mental math and realized the sheer, staggering magnitude of what was happening. At the exact moment my toxic family would be gathered in their private dining room, desperately trying to maintain the grand illusion of their wealth, the local television news would be broadcasting my name, my corporate title, and my massive $20 million philanthropic donation directly into their living room. It was an opportunity so perfectly constructed that no Hollywood screenwriter could have possibly written it better. I picked up my expensive fountain pen. I checked the box that said gladly attending. I was not just going to attend my parents' anniversary party. I was going to walk directly into the lion's den. The drive up the winding, manicured driveway of my parents' exclusive suburban country club felt like driving backward through time. It had been 15 years since I was essentially banished from this elite, socially obsessed bubble. I chose my wardrobe for the evening with the cold, calculating precision of a military general planning a siege. I was wearing a simple, tailored navy blue sheath dress. It had absolutely no visible logos and no flashy hardware. It was a masterpiece of stealth wealth. The dress was crafted by an exclusive independent designer in Milan, and it cost more than the original down payment on my parents' first home. But to my family, who only understood wealth if it was plastered with tacky designer monograms, it looked like something I had picked up on clearance at a discount department store. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted them to look at me and see the pathetic, struggling dropout they had invented in their minds. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining hall and stepped inside. The room was dripping in aggressive, opulent floral arrangements and overflowing champagne towers. There were roughly 40 extended family members gathered inside. These were the aunts, the uncles, and the second cousins who had spent the last 15 years listening to my parents completely rewrite history. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the lively background chatter abruptly died. 40 pairs of eyes locked onto me. I could instantly feel the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective pity and their barely concealed judgment. It took exactly 12 seconds for my mother, Beatrice, to intercept me. She practically materialized out of the crowd, wearing a heavily sequined designer gown. Her face immediately twisted into a highly theatrical mask of exaggerated maternal concern. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails digging slightly into my skin. "Valerie, sweetheart," she practically shouted, ensuring her voice carried over the soft classical music playing in the background. "You actually came. We were so deeply worried you would not be able to afford the gas money to drive all the way out here to the suburbs. But look at you. You made it." She offered a saccharine smile and aggressively patted my arm. She was loudly establishing my financial inferiority to the entire room. I simply smiled pleasantly and gently removed her hand from my arm, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she wanted. Before Beatrice could formulate another passive-aggressive insult, the crowd parted and my older brother Preston swaggered into our circle. He was wearing an incredibly flashy custom-tailored suit that I knew for a fact was currently sitting on a maxed-out high-interest corporate credit card. He smelled like expensive scotch and desperate arrogance. "Well, if it is not the long-lost little sister," Preston announced, his voice booming with fake joviality. He took a slow, dramatic sip of his scotch and looked me up and down with total disdain. "Listen, Valerie, my new logistics firm is expanding at a massive rate. We are completely disrupting the supply chain. I actually just fired my front desk receptionist yesterday. The pay is minimum wage, and you would have to answer phones all day. But honestly, I could pull some strings with human resources. Family takes care of family, right? Even the dropouts." He wanted to completely humiliate me in front of our parents. I stood there holding a simple glass of sparkling water, staring into the arrogant eyes of a man who was literally days away from total corporate bankruptcy. I thought about the desperate $2 million bridge loan application sitting on my desk. "That is incredibly generous of you, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I will absolutely keep your financial situation in mind." He frowned slightly, confused by my phrasing, but his massive ego quickly brushed it aside. I casually glanced down at my sleek, unbranded smartwatch. The digital numbers glowed brightly. It was exactly 5:58 in the evening. The local television broadcast was just finishing its commercial break. It was finally time to pull the trigger. I turned slightly toward my uncle, Winston, who was standing near the edge of our circle. I gestured politely toward the large flat-screen television that was currently mounted above the private mahogany bar. "Uncle Winston," I said, my voice carrying just enough volume to cut through my brother's loud boasting. "Do you mind turning up the volume on the television? I heard there is a massive breaking news story broadcasting right now. I think it is something everyone in this room is going to want to see." Uncle Winston grabbed the heavy black television remote and firmly pressed the volume button. The soft, elegant classical music was instantly drowned out by the sharp, urgent tone of the local evening news broadcast. The screen displayed a bright breaking news graphic, and the camera cut to an anchor sitting at a sleek news desk. "Good evening, Chicago," the news anchor announced. "Tonight, we are taking you live to a historic and deeply moving event at the Chicago Institute of Advanced Medicine, where a massive ribbon-cutting ceremony is currently underway." The broadcast cut to a live feed of the hospital campus. The camera panned upward, revealing a genuinely staggering architectural marvel. It was a massive, beautiful building constructed entirely of sleek modern glass and dark steel. A huge crowd was gathered in front of the grand entrance. The camera zoomed in on a polished wooden podium where the governor of Illinois was adjusting the microphone. Today, we are celebrating a legacy of immense compassion and visionary leadership, the governor announced, his voice echoing with profound gravity. This state-of-the-art, $20 million medical research and remote care facility was fully funded by a single anonymous donor. A collective murmur of deep, impressed shock rippled through my parents' private dining room. $20 million. I watched my father, Harrison, physically lean forward in his chair. His greedy eyes widened slightly. He was probably wondering if there was any possible way he could network with this mysterious billionaire to secure a massive financial bailout for Preston. When our donor asked to remain anonymous until today, the governor continued, she did not want the focus to be on her immense wealth. 15 years ago, this young woman was a brilliant freshman in a computer science department with a flawless 3.9 grade point average. But she received a deeply tragic phone call. Her beloved grandmother was diagnosed with aggressive early-onset dementia. The air in the private dining room suddenly turned incredibly thick. A few of the older aunts and uncles started to look uncomfortable. They shot quick, confused glances at my mother. Beatrice's fake smile completely froze on her face. The heavy crystal wine glass in her hand began to tremble very slightly. When the rest of her immediate family completely abandoned this terrified elderly woman, the governor said, his voice growing thick with emotion, this 19-year-old student made the ultimate heartbreaking sacrifice. She surrendered her full-ride scholarship and became a full-time caregiver because no one else would protect her grandmother. And from that profound empathy, she built a revolutionary digital health platform. Today, she is the chief executive officer and sole founder of Nova Health Tech. The sound that escaped my brother Preston's throat was something between a choked gasp and a pathetic whimper. All the arrogant color instantly vanished from his face. Nova Health Tech. The exact massive venture capital firm he had desperately begged for a $2 million bailout just 48 hours ago. His hands started shaking so violently that the ice cubes in his Scotch glass rattled aggressively. It is my greatest absolute honor to introduce the namesake of this magnificent building, the governor shouted over the applause. Please join me in celebrating the brilliant, visionary, Valerie Kensington. The camera instantly cut away to a massive solid bronze plaque mounted on the front of the stunning glass building. The bold, deeply engraved letters filled the entire television screen. The Margaret Kensington Medical Wing. Donated by Valerie Kensington. Beatrice's fingers went completely numb. The heavy crystal wine glass slipped directly through her manicured fingers. It plummeted toward the ground and hit the polished hardwood floor of the country club with a violent, aggressive shatter. Deep red wine splattered across the floorboards, looking exactly like fresh blood spreading around her designer shoes. The silence that instantly swallowed the room was terrifying. 40 people stopped breathing simultaneously. No one moved. One by one, every single head in the room slowly turned away from the glowing television screen. 40 pairs of eyes, completely shocked and utterly terrified, locked entirely onto me. For 10 agonizing seconds, the private dining room felt like a completely airtight vacuum. I stood perfectly still in the back of the room, watching my mother desperately try to process the catastrophic destruction of her carefully curated social reality. In a fraction of a second, Beatrice's face morphed from absolute horrified shock into a mask of manic, desperate maternal pride. She physically stepped directly over the dangerous shards of broken glass. She threw her arms wide open and practically sprinted toward me. "Valerie, my beautiful daughter," she shrieked, ensuring every single relative could hear her sudden shift in tone. "Oh my God, you did it. I always knew you were an absolute genius. We always believed in you, sweetheart. Come here and give your mother a hug." The sheer breathtaking audacity of her performance was almost impressive. She was aggressively trying to rewrite reality on the exact spot. I did not say a single word. I simply planted my expensive designer heels firmly on the floor and took one deliberate, highly calculated step backward. I let her arms grasp nothing but empty air. Beatrice stumbled forward slightly, her theatrical hug completely rejected in front of everyone. A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd of relatives. Before my mother could attempt another physical assault on my personal boundaries, Preston aggressively pushed past her. The arrogant swagger was completely gone. His face was a sickly pale gray color, and sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. "Wait," Preston stammered, his voice cracking with panic and a sudden sickening wave of greed. "You're the chief executive officer of Nova Health Tech? That means you own the venture capital division. My logistics firm, the $2 million bridge loan application. I submitted it to your firm 48 hours ago." Preston suddenly smiled a frantic, terrifying smile. "Valerie, this is absolutely perfect. You can manually push the approval through the committee right now. We can partner up. Kensington and Kensington. You inject the $2 million into my infrastructure, and I give you a minority equity stake in my company. Family takes care of family, right?" He actually thought he was doing me a favor. He genuinely believed that because he was the golden son, he was automatically entitled to the fortune I had spent 15 brutal years building from absolute scratch. "You are not my partner, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold decibel that instantly silenced his frantic pitch. "And I have absolutely zero interest in owning a minority stake in a sinking ship that was built entirely on our parents' stolen retirement funds." My father, Harrison, finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The mention of his secretly drained retirement accounts completely shattered his stoic facade. He pushed his way to the front of the circle, his face flushed dark red with anger and profound humiliation. "That is quite enough, Valerie," Harrison barked, using his deep, authoritative executive voice. "You are causing a massive scene in front of our guests. This is private family business. You have a moral obligation to help your brother protect the family legacy." "It is incredibly fascinating that you want to talk about privacy now, Harrison," I said loudly, ensuring my voice carried to the very back of the hushed dining room. "Because 15 years ago, you and Beatrice had absolutely no problem telling every single person in this room that I was a pathetic academic failure. You made my destruction a completely public spectacle. So, we are going to finish this conversation right here in the exact same public arena you created." I slowly unclasped my small designer clutch. I reached inside and pulled out my sleek, encrypted smartphone. I watched my mother's eyes widen in pure, visceral terror. I calmly opened the digital folder permanently labeled Motivation. I tapped on the first high-resolution screenshot. "I want to share a very specific memory with everyone in this room," I announced. 15 years ago, I was a 19-year-old girl sitting in a freezing car with exactly $14 to my name. I had just sacrificed my full-ride academic scholarship to move back to Illinois and become a full-time caregiver for my grandmother, Margaret, because her own son, Harrison, refused to pay for her memory care facility. On that freezing night, I sent Beatrice a desperate text message begging for a few $100s just so I could buy groceries and basic blood pressure medication. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered aunts and uncles. In the wealthy elite circles of suburban Chicago, abandoning an elderly family member to live in poverty was the ultimate unforgivable social sin. "And this is exactly what my loving, supportive mother sent back to me," I continued. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply read her own vicious, venomous words aloud to the entire room with absolute crystal clarity. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family," I read, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a final verdict. "Do not try to use Margaret as a pathetic excuse for the fact that you simply could not handle college academics. We know the truth. We are telling all the neighbors and our friends at the club that you moved home because you were failing your classes and dropping out. We are not funding your laziness. Do not ever contact us for money again." I lowered the phone. Beatrice let out a choked, desperate sound. She covered her face with her hands, shaking violently. The relatives who had spent 15 years treating me like a pathetic failure suddenly realized they had been weaponized by a massive toxic lie. I turned my attention away from my sobbing mother and locked my eyes onto my older brother. Now let us address the $2 million elephant in the room. My executive team spent the last 48 hours tearing your corporate disclosures completely apart. And what they found was nothing short of absolute financial fraud. You have generated absolutely zero sustainable revenue in the last 3 quarters. You have been using massive corporate credit lines to lease luxury vehicles and host lavish dinners. Harrison lunged forward. "Valerie, stop talking right now," he barked, his voice trembling with terror. But I did not stop. I looked directly at my father and delivered the final crushing blow to his massive patriarchal ego. My forensic accounting team also discovered exactly how Preston has been keeping his sinking ship afloat. Harrison, you secretly drained your entire executive retirement portfolio to fund his massive vanity project. And when that money completely ran out, you took out a highly leveraged, secretive second mortgage on your sprawling suburban house. You are literally swimming in hundreds of thousands of dollars of personal debt just to protect the illusion that your son is a brilliant businessman. The dining room erupted into absolute chaotic whispers. Mortgaging a house to fund a failing business was the ultimate sign of absolute financial incompetence. Harrison stood frozen, the terrifying reality of his total bankruptcy publicly exposed to the exact people he wanted to impress most. Preston fell to his knees. He actually dropped down onto the hardwood floor right next to the puddle of spilled red wine and shattered crystal. "Valerie, I am begging you," Preston sobbed. "I will lose absolutely everything. They will take my cars. I will be completely ruined. Please, you have $400 million. $2 million is absolutely nothing to you. You can save me. We are your family." I looked down at the pathetic 37-year-old man weeping on the floor. I looked at my mother hiding her face in deep, humiliating shame. And I looked at my father staring at me with complete, utter defeat. They had spent 15 years treating me like an invisible burden, and now they dared to weaponize the concept of family to demand my hard-earned fortune. "You are completely right, Harrison," I said, slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "Family is supposed to deeply care for each other. But 15 years ago, when your own mother was terrified and losing her mind, you chose to fund a fraternity party instead of paying for her medical care. You told me you simply did not have the liquidity to help her. So, I am just honoring the exact same boundaries you established. Your son is a terrible investment, and Nova Health Tech simply does not have the liquidity to fund his frat party. The loan is formally and permanently denied." I turned my back on the weeping golden child, the sobbing mother, and the utterly broken father. I adjusted the strap of my designer clutch on my shoulder, and I began walking toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. The crowd silently parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to walk right through the center of the room. I was finally walking out of the darkness and stepping directly into the brilliant, undeniable light of my own massive success. The social fallout from that anniversary dinner was absolutely biblical. Gossip is the ultimate currency in elite suburban society. By the following Monday morning, the entire country club network knew exactly what had happened in that private dining room. For toxic narcissists like my mother, social death is infinitely worse than physical death. Beatrice was completely ostracized by her peers. The elite charity boards she desperately clung to quietly asked her to step down. Her wealthy friends suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. She was publicly exposed as the cruel mother who threw away a brilliant tech mogul just to coddle a pathetic, bankrupt son. Preston's financial ruin was absolutely spectacular. Without my $2 million emergency capital injection, his logistics firm went into formal receivership exactly 4 days later. Federal creditors seized all of his leased luxury vehicles from his corporate parking garage. They locked the glass doors of his downtown office and auctioned off his ridiculous espresso machines to pay back pennies on the dollar to his furious investors. To survive, Preston eventually had to take a job as a basic shift manager at a local retail electronics store, answering directly to a regional manager who was 10 years younger than him. Because Harrison had secretly drained his retirement accounts and taken out a massive second mortgage, the bank eventually came for the sprawling suburban mansion. My parents simply could not make the massive monthly payments without Harrison's executive salary, which he had recently lost after being forced into early retirement due to the public humiliation of his terrible financial mismanagement. They were forced to sell their picture-perfect house at a massive, devastating loss just to avoid total foreclosure. They had to pack up their shattered egos and move into a cramped, incredibly basic two-bedroom condominium on the other side of the city. And the absolute ultimate poetic justice was that Preston had to move into the tiny spare bedroom of that condo with them. Three miserable, toxic people trapped in a tiny apartment, drowning in debt and entirely blaming each other for their total destruction. About 2 months after the country club confrontation, I received a long, frantic handwritten letter in the mail from Beatrice. She spent 4 pages desperately trying to play the ultimate victim, writing that they were living in absolute squalor compared to their old life. She begged me to buy them a new house, claiming it was my moral duty to rescue my parents from poverty. I did not write a letter back. I did not call her to explain my feelings. I simply walked over to my home office and fed the 4-page letter directly into the industrial paper shredder. Then I instructed the front desk security team of my high-rise building to permanently block any visitors or packages bearing the Kensington last name. I officially closed the door on my abusers and locked it forever. The very next week, I formally walked the halls of the newly opened Margaret Kensington Medical Wing. As I stepped through the massive glass doors, I saw hundreds of doctors, researchers, and patients building brilliant futures and finding hope. I walked up to the heavy bronze plaque near the entrance and traced my fingers over my grandmother's name. She would have been so incredibly proud. My mother accused me of being a heartless monster for letting my own flesh and blood lose their home when I could have saved them with pocket change. So, tell me, am I the jerk for letting their fake empire burn to the ground, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below to let me know your verdict on this family, and I'll see you in the next video.